Well, greetings, friends. Here we are for another campaign edition of the Danielle Smith Show. As you know, I, throughout the course of the last 2 years, have been trying to find voices that would give us some balanced perspective so that we knew what we were dealing with and the consequences of what would happen from some of the restrictions. And one of the most vocal and effective groups out there is a group called Families for Choice. Cathryn Carruthers started it with some fellow parents, and they grew very, very quickly. I ended up doing a podcast with or a Zoom call with her and her parents, and Angela Pitt actually was on that call as well. She kind of played the role of interviewing me so that we could share some of the concerns that we were hearing. But it's a group that has been very effective, and sometimes when policy changes get tweaked, you sometimes wonder, where did that one come from? This group is one that you should be involved with, because if we're going to be on the cusp of having various voices calling for lockdowns and restrictions again, and I'm sad to say it's already occurring. I did notice that yesterday was the last official COVID update. And one of the stories I read was one of the usual voices that we've been hearing over the last 2 years, a doctor who said he wants the government to be prepared to get into lockdown again in the fall. And the thing I find frustrating about that is that we know so much more about this virus. So many more people have been infected by it. So many people have been vaccinated. And it strikes me as odd that we would consider doing the same kind of approach 2 years later that we did 2 years ago when we didn't know anything about this virus. So the big issue that we have is the disproportionately negative impact it's having on our kids. And that's why I wanted to talk with Families for Choice spokesperson Cathryn Carruthers, just to understand a few of the things that got them going, what it is that they advocated for, some of the successes that they have, and also some of the issues that they're watching, so that we don't return to the same problems that we have in the fall. Cathryn, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me, Danielle. It's so nice to do an interview in long form where no one gets to misconstrue what I've said.
I know, and it's very hard, because anyone who has raised concerns about vaccination and wants vaccine choice has been mischaracterized, in my opinion, in a lot of ways. And what I find so interesting about your group is that most of the founders and many of the parents have been vaccinated themselves. But and that's why I think people need to hear your perspective about why it is you're doing this particular advocacy for kids. So tell us what got you to start this up. Tell us the founding of your group.
So we started in the fall of 2021. I lined up to take my shots as soon as I was eligible, and so did many other parents. And then when it came to the kids, not everybody was ready. I mean, there was a large proportion of parents who just didn't feel that that was either something that they wanted to do or were able to do. And so I guess, really the genesis of our group was I spoke to some mums at school drop off, school pickup last September, and we thought, wow, we're into the third academic year of this pandemic. And what's it going to look like? And so one mum, who's now since become a very good friend of mine, one of my co-founders, she was in tears at the school gates. I ushered her into my truck and said, "What's going on?" And she said, "I'm just so worried about what's going to happen to these kids this year, especially now that the 12-year-olds and up are eligible, and soon it's going to be the 5 to 11-year-olds that are going to be eligible for the shot." And at that point, the vaccine passport had just come in Alberta as well. So we just said, look, we need to do something about this. And so we got together. There were a group of maybe 8 people in a living room, all mums, and we had a meeting, and everybody agreed we needed to do something. A couple of weeks later, we had another meeting, and there were maybe 50 people in the room and on Zoom. And then our next one, we exploded 2 weeks later. I think we had over 600 people. So we really tapped into something that people were concerned about, and they wanted. I think another important part is we'd lost so much connection with other people in the year and a half previous to that people were looking for a form of community, and especially a supportive community, because as we know, anything to do with COVID is seen as controversial. Whatever you say, there's always someone willing to judge you. And so I think we hit a nerve, and our numbers really exploded overnight.
Can you explain for someone who might not understand, if your parents and you yourself were willing to get vaccinated, what is the issue with getting kids vaccinated? Why is there some reluctance?
Oh, there's a few things. There are a lot of people who just wanted time. They didn't want to be forced into to do something for their kids just on an arbitrary schedule, really, just because something was approved with emergency use authorization. We have to be clear about that as well. So there was people asking for time. Some people for sure had concerns about both the safety and efficacy data of the vaccines. But we've got to bear in mind, there was only one that was approved. It was Pfizer, and that was it. You didn't get to choose, as I did. I got to choose AstraZeneca or Moderna or Pfizer. So for the kids, it was just one. And also by that point, many of the children had COVID, either with no symptoms at all or very mild. And so the justification for really saying that these kids had to get vaccinated when they'd already had the illness, the people were concerned about that too. So I think people just, they want, the thing that we heard over and over again is we want time. Don't force us to have our kids undergo a medical treatment just because you say so. And so we wanted to make sure that those voices were being heard. And at the time when we started, of course it caused some controversy, but it doesn't matter. I mean, when your parents fighting for your kids, you're not going to stop. So we just kept going.
Can you walk us through a timeline of what it was like to be a parent with kids in the system over these past are we coming up on 3 years? Gosh, or is it just, it's remarkable, isn't it? It's over 2.5 years, it's almost 2.5 years now. But tell us what it was like, because I think that there were other jurisdictions where the schools were closed longer. I know we had hybrids of being online versus being in school. I also know that there were delays in opening the classroom. I want to understand what that was like in trying to manage that for your kids. So tell me your recollection of how all of this went down, going back to March of 2020 from a school perspective.
It was really hard, so hard. So this all happened overnight. So on the Friday, your kids are going to school normally. And then on Sunday, there's a press conference where schools are shutting down effective immediately for the rest of the school year. And this was, I believe it was March 15th. It was mid-March, and that was it. And so then it was a huge scramble to figure out now what. And so I have young children, and at the time they were even younger. And so the prospect of online schooling just seemed really daunting. And so I have to say, and then we went into spring break. And so I believe that the school boards used that time to figure out what to do. So there was a lot of trial and error. But having kids home and trying to juggle their online schooling with your work, any other commitments that you might have, and especially because there was literally nowhere else to go. If you remember in the spring of 2020, you basically left your house to get groceries, and that was it. And so it was really hard for people, and even it just added so much stress to families. And especially then if parents were unable to work, then there was the financial stress that came with that. Also, kids, youth, everyone, they need to be around their peers. I would say especially the teenagers, they had a really tough time being at home. They're supposed to be out there learning how to navigate relationship dynamics and learning how to be independent, and they were stuck at home with their parents. So that the first few months was really hard. And then we went into the school year, and the kids were cohorted, they were masked all the time. And I must say, I have nieces and nephews in the UK. Over there, young kids were never masked over there. Like
Really?
No, they just weren't. And they were never cohorted in the same way. So for example, one day when my son came home and said, "Oh, it's Thursday tomorrow. That means that my class gets to play on the playground at lunchtime." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, they have a schedule, so you weren't allowed any intermixing between cohorts." So that was very bizarre for children as well. Another
Can I just ask you, for someone who didn't have to deal with the cohorting, what did that mean? Did it mean that each class was considered its own cohort, and classes weren't allowed to mix with other classes?
Yes. Yeah. And this is elementary. I'm talking elementary school, where both my kids are. I don't know how they managed it in high schools where they move around the classrooms, but in elementary schools and preschools, your cohort was your classmates, and that was that. There were kids who had never even seen other parts of the school until this February, whenever all of that was lifted. So
did that mean they weren't what happened? I'm trying to remember my normal childhood, which was going out at recess and playing kickball and baseball and being, hopscotch and all of that, going out at lunch and then being able to mingle in the gym on cold days. I'm just trying to think of how different the experience was for kids during these last 2 years.
Well, yes, because each class would be allocated a section of the school grounds. So on a Monday, you might be in the playground. On a Tuesday, you might be in the basketball court. On a Wednesday, you might be in the field. On a Thursday, you might be in the gym. And then people rotated that way. So that was really hard too, especially if you had a kid who was having trouble getting along with kids in their own class. They never got a break from them. So we heard stories of that nature too, where, bullying and things like that became an issue. And then there were the restrictions around what you had to do if your kids had certain symptoms were changing constantly. You're constantly throwing your kids in the car to the nearest testing center to get tested. There were school closures if there was more than a certain number of kids that had tested positive. The families were quarantined. I know a family with 4 kids who quarantined for almost 4 weeks in the end because of when each one of them came down with COVID. So just really, really tough. And so that was the second school year. And then, of course, last year we had open for summer. So, COVID was done, but not so fast because we went back into September. And lo and behold, we have a vaccine passport that impacts anyone in Alberta 12 years old or up. And so that was the backdrop against which the kids were going back to school for now the 3rd year of the pandemic. And the cohorting was still there, the masking was still there. Some of the rules around testing and quarantine had changed. But there were a lot of kids who were still doing a lot of online schooling because either the teacher had tested positive or they couldn't get a sub. So yeah, it's been three school years of disruption to learning. Kids that perhaps had some sort of additional needs were maybe not able to access the supports and the resources that they had. Kids who had not yet been assessed for additional needs fell through the gaps and possibly have not yet been assessed. Now, I have to give credit also to there were assessments done to see the impact of learning loss. And so where that was identified, and this is in the very early grades, then those children were given additional support to catch up. And I know that firsthand because that was the case for one of my kids. So I was very grateful for that. And it just happened automatically. I didn't have to do anything. But I think more what we're seeing now is now that we're coming out of it, the mental health in particular impact on children and their families is absolutely devastating. It just cannot be overstated.
I want to understand a bit about why that is. I think it's funny when you're an adult, it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of a kid. And I'm just trying to think of all of the missed experiences if I would have had if my schooling had been disrupted for 3 years, because I played basketball and I played volleyball and I was in drama. And have all of those things been gone? To what extent have kids been able to participate in activities in school and outside of school? How restrictive has that been?
Well, all of them, everything was gone for a period of time. I would, that the first year of the first academic year and then the second one, things started to come back last year. But then, of course, we had the vaccine passport layered on top. So if your child was, I'll give you, here's a real world example. The YMCA in Calgary has taken a lot of heat, rightly so, because the government created the restrictions exemption passport or program. Let's call it what it is. It was a vaccine passport. And so then other organizations could create their own version of that. And so the YMCA chose to not even accept negative COVID tests to let people in their facilities. So you would have a 12-year-old kid who just wasn't able to access, wasn't able to play their basketball game, even if they went to a venue, and their parent, if unvaccinated, was unable to watch either. So the YMCA just completely shut out anybody who was not vaccinated. no allowances for testing whatsoever. And then you would have kids who would show up to another game with their piece of paper saying that they just tested negative at their own expense. This was costing families anything up to $1,000 a month in tests. I mean, who can afford that? Now they're free, but back then they were like gold dust. And then the kid would have, often we heard stories where the kid would they wouldn't be allowed in because their test result wouldn't be accepted. I mean, what is that? I really struggle with that. Really, it's discrimination. And what does that do to a child's mental health? We had people tell us that their kid was a very good elite level hockey player, and now they just sit in the room and play video games. They're really depressed, they're anxious, OCD, eating disorders, self-harming, and then suicidal ideation, drugs. So it's the list goes on and on and on, and we're only just seeing the tip of that iceberg. We're only just seeing that. And so what's going to be uncovered in the following months and years, I think, is really going to be a huge wake-up call, hopefully. But what that also means is that these families are going to need some serious support.
Completely. I remember when I first heard that the language being used to talk about vaccinated versus unvaccinated, I sent out a newsletter of a school experiment that had been done about teaching kids about discrimination and segregation in the 60s. And it was an experiment called Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes with grade 3 students. And what the teacher did is they said, okay, everyone with blue eyes, you're the kings of the school today. You get to eat lunch and before anyone else, and you get to play on the school ground, and you get to go to use the water fountain, and you can't talk to the kids with brown eyes. And then they did the same thing the next day with the kids with brown eyes, saying, no, now you're the kings of the school. You can't talk to the kids with the blue eyes. And she said, all these beautiful little children turned into monsters to each other within just 15 minutes of having this kind of segregation. And so when I heard about the language being used, I thought, wow, like it's one thing for adults to be trying to process these differences, but what is it going to do to kids? Are we seeing pressure on the school grounds? Are kids being mean to each other? Did some of that happen? It was my greatest fear. And what did you experience? What did your parents tell you?
Yeah, it was happening. And it was and I actually read about a story out of the US just this week where, very sadly, a boy actually committed suicide because of the level of bullying that he was experiencing by being called unvaccinated when in fact he was vaccinated. It's just crazy. I mean, it's totally mind-boggling. There's also families where the children, it's caused a big rift between the children and their parents, because children, they developmentally, they don't have capacity to the same logic and rationale that we do as adults. And so they want to fit in, especially teenagers. They want to fit in. And if their parents were holding them back from saying, hey, we're not quite ready, we don't think that this is what we want to do for these reasons, sometimes the kids were really pushing back on that, and they just wanted to do it because they wanted to be like everybody else. And I totally empathize with that. So the fact that, I'll compare it with the UK, where my family lives. There was never a universal rollout of vaccinations for 5 to 11-year-olds. It was offered to 12 and ups, but 5 to 11-year-olds really were only eligible if they had certain higher risk factors or members of their family did. And so therefore it never became a topic in school. No one talked about it, what your vaccination status was. Even adults, they just don't really talk about it. Even in Hong Kong, which has a zero COVID policy, I was speaking to a client there and explaining to him how things were here last winter. And even Hong Kong, with how strict it is, they never had a vaccine passport for children or a vaccine requirement. They just had masks, which is commonplace in Asia. So things just didn't really seem to add up. So there's been impact. We have moms tell us that this is either threatening their marriage or their marriage has ended over what's happened over the past couple of years. And so this was my big concern, actually. One of the if you want to get to the core reason of why I started Families for Choice, because there's layers to that onion, the core one is that I grew up in Northern Ireland with tribalism. So you were Protestant or you were Catholic. And so we were divided into tribes from birth. And your schooling, everything, your sports that you played, the language that you spoke was all determined by which side of the fence you were on. And that was really devastating and ultimately led to terrorism and a civil war. And so that didn't happen overnight, of course. That happened over quite a long period of time. But whenever whenever we saw the vaccine passport for the 12s and ups come in, and we knew that the approval for vaccines for 5 to 11-year-olds was coming any day, that's when we had to kind of band together and say, hang on a second, we're not, you know, there's no way that you can include young children in a vaccine passport. That's it. So everyone has their own reasons for activating, let's call it. And everybody has their own red line. And for many of us parents, our red line was crossed in the fall of 2021.
The interesting thing is, I think we were given the impression that, well, everybody's doing this. We're not doing anything that's different than anyone else. I think there was also this sort of impression that we were less restrictive than other jurisdictions. But you've given an example of where they didn't have the same restrictions at all. Can you give us any more examples internationally of where we should have looked to? Did anyone really get this perfectly right? I think Sweden was one of the areas where they didn't shut down schools. I don't know what their masking policy was or their cohorting policy was, but if we had done this optimally, what would we have done? Was there a jurisdiction to look to?
Well, I think the UK actually did. I mean, no jurisdiction was perfect, and everybody tried their best to varying degrees of success. The UK, a lot of the data came from Israel because they were kind of at the forefront of vaccine distribution, and so the UK was often several weeks behind, and then we were several weeks behind that. Yeah, for sure, the Scandinavian countries took a different view very early on and took a lot of heat for that. But data has since come out that actually it was for the benefit of the children to keep schools open. And the UK did have some online schooling, but as I say, the younger children were never masked, and the older children didn't wear their masks. I have friends who are teachers there. They just said, hey, I have enough to deal with teaching these kids. I don't want to fight with them about a mask.
You know, it's interesting. I think I may have seen the same article as you out of Sweden, because they were measuring, I think it was deterioration in learning, because I think there are some kids who've fallen behind, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I think what they found in Sweden is that there's really not much evidence that occurred. So the school outcomes are just as you would expect if there had been no lockdowns. But what are we seeing here? Do we know how to quantify where the losses in learning might be?
I don't know specifically on that yet. That data is really in its infancy. But what we do know, and this is based on Alberta government data, is that when you look at the excess deaths since the pandemic began, the group that is most disproportionately represented in excess deaths is actually children and youth. And so what does that say?
People need to understand those are non-COVID deaths as well. So it's not like they were dying of COVID. What was happening? What were they dying of?
We don't know, because when it's with regard to a minor, it's very, very hard to get information about cause of death and things like that. If you remember during COVID, there was some backtracking that went on whenever children were attributed as having very sadly died from COVID, and then it actually wasn't. So it's tricky to get data on that, especially when I think it may not serve the policies, if you like. So what we're hearing is people stopped going to the doctor, for one thing. So there were possibly physical illnesses that were not addressed as they might have otherwise been on a timely basis. But there's a ton of mental health, lots of new addictions, and eating disorders and things that potentially led to, there were a lot more suicides, very sadly, tons of overdoses. I mean, we had more overdose deaths in general in Alberta, way more than we did COVID fatalities. So that's the part. And even I live in Calgary. I've never, in the past few weeks, I've lived here for 13 years. I've never seen so many people either overdosing or on the verge of overdosing openly on the street, open drug use on the street. The opioid epidemic I guess is the next thing, that and kids are being caught up in that because they didn't have their sports to go to or their activities. So I guess that it's a long answer to say we don't quite know yet, but anecdotally, we've had dozens of families reach out to us with their stories, and they're really, really hard to listen to. They're hard to read because we're talking about real people. We're talking about real kids in Alberta. And to think that children and youth have suffered in the way that they have is absolutely inexcusable. And we will do everything that we can, and I know you will as well, Danielle, to make sure that that never happens again. And also to make sure that the children who are suffering and their families are getting support and the resources that they need.
100%. I put out a video in this past week saying we're not going to lock down again. Kids are not going to be prevented from going to school. Businesses won't be locked down. And I must tell you, sort of the officialdom, the chattering classes, I've had all kinds of media contacting me saying, how can you say this? How can you be sure? And I guess I wouldn't mind if you could, you've talked a lot about the kids, but I wonder if there's some more stories that we need to tell you. You'd mentioned that this was also particularly hard on the university age kids, the older kids, because I'm very sensitive to the fact I interviewed Dr. Ari Jaffe before, just as we were getting into this, and his contention, he was from the Stollery, his contention was that we were going to see as much as 10 times the number of losses in lives lost, years of lives lost, because of all the things you just talked about: undiagnosed illness, overdose, suicide, depression, cancers, heart disease, the marital breakdown, and the impact that will have on long-term health. So he was anticipating over this period of time, we're now going to see 10 times the worst outcomes. And I think that that's the balance that people don't understand, is that it was not really about balancing lives and livelihoods. It's about balancing lives and lives, that there are lives being lost because of the experience people had over the last couple of years. Now, if you wouldn't mind, if I know that you represent parents who have younger kids, but what have you been hearing about the older kids as well? Because it's not been easy for them either.
No, it's not. I mean, if you think about anyone who was going into grade 12, or they didn't have a graduation, they got their diploma, but they didn't sit their exams. I mean, that's the pinnacle of your education, and you didn't get to do that. So this was really hard. I know people. I personally know even family members in university, and they and this, I've heard this repeated so many times, is that a lot of young adults who never had any mental health issues before, everyone's medicated, everyone's on antidepressants, everyone's medicated. Not everyone, I can't say everyone, but a lot of people, everyone I speak to, anxiety medications, they developed things like OCD. So it's hitting them really hard. And if I can share a story of a family that I know personally in Calgary, they have a daughter who is at U of C. And this daughter has very complex medical conditions, to the extent that she has 13 specialists looking after her.
Wow.
12 of whom agreed that because of her medical conditions that I won't go into, they said that she could not take the vaccine. But not one of them, this is another story, but not one of them was willing to write her an exemption letter, because the doctors were all being threatened that they would have their licenses pulled by the college for writing exemptions. So you have this girl who was going into, I believe it was her second year at U of C, facing this vaccine mandate, but was unable to take the shot or get an exemption. So her family actually sued U of C. And let's be frank, they spent their life savings on this. They threw everything at this for their daughter, and they were unsuccessful, and they appealed it, and then they were successful on appeal, and so she did get the exemption. However, very, very soon after that, the U of C reversed its vaccine policy in the first place. And so that, essentially they put everything into it only for this policy that never made any sense to be reversed. So that's, and then so the same daughter needs to go to the US for treatment. and she needs to spend a few weeks down there to get treatment, which is also very expensive. But because of, even with the new federal travel mandate rules that just changed, we're speaking in June, and they just changed. She can leave the country now, so she can go to the US for treatment. But when she comes back, she and her family that have to accompany her have to quarantine for 2 weeks. So she can't get treatment because the parents can't afford to take that time off work. And then, they have another child who has sunk into a deep depression. Previously was very active, very good athlete, and they're spending $400 a week on therapies for her to try and bring her back to her normal self. It's just devastating.
I talked to a mom who had an 18-year-old boy who was just heading off on his mission. And she said, you know what, he was gone for 2 years and just not the same kid. He used to be really talkative, really chatty, and he's just finally coming back into his own. And so a lot of parents, and she was tearing up as she was telling me this. So a lot of parents, I think, are really worried that their kids are going to suffer long-term consequences from this. Kids are resilient. And I wonder if that's maybe one of the things that we as adults have just sort of taken for granted, that kids will bounce back. What do we need to do to make sure that they do? Everything you're telling me makes me very concerned that there's going to be a lot of assessment work that we need to do to make sure that if there are undiagnosed learning disabilities, we find them. If their kids are falling behind in math or in English, in being able to read or write, we need to be able to diagnose that now. If kids are struggling, we have to find some way of helping them to cope with what happened over the last 2 years so that they don't end up with a lifetime on medication. And I'm wondering if you've got some thoughts on how we can address that now so that we can limit the long-term harm that might come from what's happened. Oh, I think Cathryn might be frozen. Or I've got her dumbfounded. Sometimes this happens with StreamYard. I don't know, Laura, if you're able to get Cathryn dialed in here. Maybe I'll just remove Cathryn for a minute and we'll see if we can get her back on the screen. I hope that's not me. That's the problem, but we'll see if we can get Cathryn dialed back in. Let me just go through and read through some of the comments that are coming in, because there's many that are coming in. Yeah, a lot of you are saying that it is heart-wrenching, and it is. And this is why I've been very concerned about what the long-term consequences are going to be here. And we have to make sure, and I know some of you may be persuaded by those in the medical establishment who still are under the impression that lockdowns are effective. I think this is the side of the story that we haven't necessarily heard. This side of the story where we clearly have to look at what's happening at the younger generation. What else have we got here? We need to assess the suicide rates, the bankruptcies, the family breakdown that occurred due to these mandates. That's the only way to assess the true cost. I couldn't agree more. Another person says, let me see, what else have we got here? Billy Carson, yes, I believe freedom will win, but it will take years of misery to get there. Who knows? Only time will tell. Let me see if there's, I wonder if I'm going to have to pause this while we see if we can get Cathryn back on, because I'm not sure. This is, what we would do in the radio business? We would go to a commercial break and see if we could get our guest back. If we're not going to be able to, I might have to leave it here, and we can potentially do a second round with Cathryn. Just know that when I did do my announcement earlier this week, Cathryn has been very influential in my thinking about what we need to do when we get into the next round of respiratory virus season, because we know that there is going to be a new variant. There always will be. We know that there's going to be influenza as well, which is also very dangerous to kids. But I think if we have in the back of our heads when we're making decisions, what kind of impact is it going to have on the younger generation, then I think that helps us to balance our approach. We have to take an approach that, in my opinion, protects those who are most at risk, which is our seniors in long-term care with multiple pre-existing conditions, and be mindful that if we're making certain decisions that are going to impact the younger generation, that we have some programs in place to make sure that they don't fall behind. Well, my friends, it looks to me like Cathryn might have some instability in her dial-up. I'll see if perhaps we can maybe do this again sometime, and we'll do a round two to give you a little bit more of the things that she's looking at covering in the future, because I've talked to her about some of the successes that she had in doing some lobbying, and I've also talked to her about what she's hoping to avoid in the new year. Oh, there
I,
she is. I think we got her back. All right,
I don't know
Cathryn,
what
you're
happened
telling
there.
such an amazing story that I just wanted to make sure that we didn't leave it there. So, before we run out of time on this, I want to go through so that people understand where you've had your success, because I know that you identified some key issues, and people never see the hard work of advocates like you behind the scenes. They see the outcome, and I want people to understand, if they want to join your group so that they can continue to fight alongside with you. Tell us a few of the things that you fought at the beginning of this year, because I think you had 4 very quick successes. So tell us about those.
We did, and so I must say that there's much more to Families for Choice than me. There's a group of 4 co-founders. We have a core volunteer team of about a dozen people, and then of course we have our membership, who also got very much involved in all of our campaigns, whether that was letter writing, calling your MLA, calling your MP, you name it, we did it. So yes, we influenced 4 policies in 4 months, which was phenomenal. The first one was a commitment by the government that COVID vaccination would not be a requirement to attend school in Alberta. So that was key. The second one was that the 5 to 11-year-olds would not be scooped up into the vaccine passport. So those 2 were before Christmas. And then in January, of course, anyone who's a parent in Alberta knows that your kids were at home for an extra week, at least an extra week in January. And so that entire week, and even the week before, we lobbied really hard to make sure that schools would reopen. And we know that we got some intel from the inside. We were facing a potentially 8-week switch to online schooling that was requested by CBE and I believe also the Edmonton Public School Board. Credit to Minister LaGrange. She said, no, figure it out. These kids need to go back to school. So that was number 3. And then the 4th one we did some work with doctors from McMaster University, who, including Dr. Martha Fulford, who's actually she's an infectious diseases specialist and chief of medicine at the faculty. And so we did a huge presentation. We invited everyone all the way up the chain in the government of Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan. And we had some very good attendance on that from politicians. And the very next day, so our tagline was "Let kids be kids." And the very next day, it was announced that under the banner "Let kids be kids," that COVID restrictions were being lifted on children, more or less with immediate effect. So I guess what we learned, none of us had done anything like this before. I have to say that. Some of us, including myself, had never been in any way involved in politics before either, but we had to kind of do something. And what we realized is that public opinion informs policy. And so we gathered as many people together as we could, all with the same message, to lobby as hard as we could and be as noisy as we could at the right time in order to influence policy announcements. And it worked.
And it's been amazing. When I heard some of the ways in which those who were wanting vaccine choice were being characterized by the media and by politicians, I just thought, this is really unfair, because most of the people I've met, especially in Calgary, really are like 30 and 40-year-old moms and dads who are worried about their kids. And I'm wondering how you've been feeling about the way the vaccine choice movement has been characterized, because I know we talked beforehand that you have to be very careful that you're not being depicted as being against vaccination and being a radical. And you're very measured. You're such a great spokesperson for your organization. I'm just wondering how some of that mischaracterization has made you feel.
You know what, it doesn't bother me, because I know that I'm fighting for my kids and your kids and all of the Alberta children. And so we don't care. We're not going to stop until we get what our kids need. It's as simple as that. You don't come between a mother bear and her cub, and the same goes for human mothers and their cubs. And I have to say, there was lots of dads as well, but mostly mums. And so we did have feedback, especially in the early days, where people, they agreed with us, but they didn't want to stick their neck out and publicly say anything. And so it took, the small, noisy minority to start to really say, hey, this has got to stop. And I think we probably grew thicker skins in the process. And I asked my team that when we started to do media, to please just shield me from some of the comments, which they did. And to be honest with you, it was mostly supportive anyway. The thing that we tried to do, Danielle, is we tried to come at this with a voice of unity. So we don't care about your vaccination status. We just care about your kids. And we know that you care about your kids. And so if we can find the common ground, and it's so sad that children and education have been politicized through this. And so we just really wanted to come together to do the right thing. And so there's lots of people in the group that don't agree with each other on other issues, but it didn't matter. We put that to one side and actually then learned things about each other. So from that perspective, it's been very helpful. And that was very intentional. We wanted to take the moderate ground, which isn't easy because you're never going to please everybody. But we placed an op-ed in the Calgary Herald and the Edmonton Journal as our big kind of launch, and it was very well received. And so it sort of set our stance out early on. Now we took a lot of heat at various points in time from the media, but it doesn't stop us, and it's not going to stop us now because this isn't over. And so there's still,
and that's what I fear. I fear it isn't over because the vaccine mandates, the travel mandates have just been suspended because of the reaction of some of the medical community who seem to just be waiting for an opportunity to call for more lockdowns, because Dr. Theresa Tam has now said it's her opinion that there should be 3 jabs. I guess what I'm anticipating in the fall is there will be some respiratory virus surge, because there always is. And that will be the pretext used to now bring back new restrictions, new mandates, new passports, and all of the architecture is still there to impose those kinds of restrictions. That's what I'm fearful of, is that there's the media seems to be gearing up to be calling for that again. And I'm wondering what your counter to that will be. Do you share the fears, and what would you like to see instead? If you were going to advise politicians about what they should do when that fall respiratory virus season hits again, what would you advise them?
Well, I mean, this is going to be with us like other respiratory illnesses, seasonal like flu. So we have the benefit now of 2 years worth of experience. Politicians have to be really honest with people what these mandates and restrictions are all about. It's actually not. You can't say with a straight face that a vaccine passport keeps everyone in that establishment safe. Mm-hmm. We now know that the vaccine is more effective at reducing severity of illness, and the effect on transmission is marginal, if any. We know that now. And so I believe there was intentional mixed messaging being pushed out in order to kind of confuse people and perhaps sow those seeds of fear. It's time for some honesty, and I'm glad now that we're having at the federal level some pushback within Parliament as to how ridiculous the travel mandates are. But if I can just share one, they're still ridiculous. I'm going to Ireland next week with my kids, and because they're under 12, the rules that they are going to come back into Canada under are dependent on my vaccination status as their parent, not their own. But if they were 12 or over, it would be their own status. So there's a scenario where you have a family with an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old, and the 12-year-old has to quarantine because they're unvaccinated, and the 11-year-old doesn't because the parent's vaccinated. So it's like we've had enough of the inconsistencies, the things that don't make any sense. So we know, I'm hopeful that they will not change the definition of fully vaccinated to include 3 shots, because the uptake on the 3rd shot, especially amongst children, has been so low. Mm-hmm. So I'm forever an optimist anyway, but so I'm hopeful on that. Also, people just need to talk about their experience, talk with family members. I have a family member who has been very COVID cautious this entire time, but now she sees the impact on her own daughter. And so she's now more aligned with what we're saying, which is people need to get back to their everyday lives, and the healthcare system needs to be able to cope. And if that means investing in healthcare, then that's what we need to do, because the doctors and nurses and frontline workers are absolutely burned out. A lot of these issues are to do with staffing, actually. And so, you know, I think if we can try and change the conversation and acknowledge there were certain things done right, things that weren't done right, and move forwards with not putting people in a tribe, and either or, it's an and, then that's what we need. And so we're going to do that for kids, because what other option do we have?
So September hits, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, it's nobody's business. No one should be asking. When it comes to masks, no masks at all, correct? You don't want kids to be masked?
Well, if a family chooses that they want to mask, that's up to them.
But not mandates from the school.
No, because it doesn't work. I mean, we know now that masking kids in school, when the masks are down here and they're covered in flowers and they're not N95s, that they don't do what people thought they were going to do. So just give people the choice, and if people choose to mask, then respect that in the same way as we're asking to have our choice respected.
What ended up happening with the testing? I remember all the testing kits went out to the kids. Are kids still expected to test every week when they go to school? How did that roll out?
Yeah, it's not a requirement anymore. It's not required. And actually, people still have tests, and they are very careful about when they use them, because they don't want to run out, or they just don't believe in the results that they're getting. So yeah, there was a lot that parents had to keep up with, these changes around testing, quarantine rules, teachers, school boards. So no, there's no testing requirement. I'm not sure if that would come back. The message is really what it should be, which is if you're sick, stay home, wash your hands. And but one thing I have noticed is that my kids, and I think this is echoed by lots of other families, like they're constantly sick. So maybe their immune systems haven't had to fight these things for a couple of years, and now they're being kind of battered from all angles with it's just a rotating door of viruses. So yeah, that possibly might be another finding in some of this data, that there's another reason why we shouldn't be locking down kids, we shouldn't be cohorting them, we shouldn't be we for sure should not be forcing masking upon children.
Well, it's a good point. I was talking with healthcare workers who had younger kids, and they said there were years where the kids were constantly sick, because part of what happens is a child's immune system needs to be exposed, and they need to get sick in order to be able to strengthen the immune system. I'm just wondering how that's going to change going forward, because are we now going to be at a zero tolerance for sniffles? What would be the recommendation there? I'm just trying to, I used to be one of those type of people who would just work through illness. So now if I'm feeling a little sniffly, at least I can do a Zoom meeting and I can continue working and not be around anybody. But I'm not sure how we're going to manage that in a school environment, especially if you end up with the constant sort of classroom closures as a result of having a couple of sick kids in class. I'm wondering if there needs to be some additional thinking on how that's done. Is there anything around the world that we can look to for advice?
You know what, Danielle, this is at the discretion of the teacher and your school. So it depends. I have, in my own family, I have kids who are in different classrooms, and their teachers have different comfort levels around this. So that is a bit of a luck of the draw. I find that staying in communication with the teachers and saying, hey, yes, there may be some coughing today, we've tested, please don't send them home. I've also heard of schools where when you complete your medical history form at the start of the school year, you can add allergies in there, seasonal allergies, and that can, be a reason why your kid would not get sent home. So I think it's common sense, really, isn't it? It's common sense.
I sure hope we return to some common sense. Just give me some advice on what you think needs to be done on the education front, because I guess I've been of the view, and I met with the Alberta Teachers Association recently, just to see where they are at on wanting to do testing. I've been a big fan of the just sort of the Canadian Basic Skills Test. Let's do a baseline. Let's see where kids are at relative to grade level for reading, writing, math, and let's see if we can identify ways to bring them up to grade level if they've fallen behind. I don't know if I'm on the right track on that. What is it that parents want to see?
I'm not an expert in this, and it's not something that we've really delved into yet with our group. But the feedback that we get is focus on the basics, as you say, math, so numeracy, literacy, and focusing on those, and maybe reconsider some of the other stuff, that some of the social studies stuff. The parents do have concerns around some of the so-called woke things that are being pushed in school, for sure. We hear that a lot. And so this is, I think we've all been in, you talked about this resiliency thing with kids before we kind of got disconnected. Yes, they are resilient, but they've been traumatized so much. This is daily trauma that the kids have experienced without the adult brain that we have to process that. And so that's, in my mind, that's even more of a reason when it comes to education, is to focus on the basics. Don't overwhelm their systems any more than they already have been these past couple of years. Try and get everybody caught up to where they need to be, and then we can figure this out. But actually, the important thing is making sure that kids are, and this goes back to a question you had earlier, that physical and mental health and emotional health and well-being are supported. And to me, that's the key. Because a child who's stressed or under stress can't learn. And so we have to find ways to support them, to make them feel, that there's stability, security, certainty, before we, I think, worry too much about, the nitty gritty of the syllabus or curriculum.
Do you have any thoughts on how, I mean, I've talked to a psychologist to find out how we deal with this mass mental health issue that we're going to face, because it isn't just, I mean, it's kids, it's the university kids, it's their parents, it's adults, it's seniors. I feel like we're going to face a huge demand for mental health resources. And I'm just wondering if you've come across any resources that you're sharing with your parent group to help kids kind of process what they went through so that they can get to the other side of thinking about the future. Because I feel like we almost need a mass psychology session or a mass counseling session just to come to terms with what's happened so that we can just process it and put it in the right spot. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or are you sharing any resources with your families?
This is actually the sort of thing that the families share the resources with us, which is great. So it's a two-way information transfer. There's definitely a shortage of pediatric psychologists and psychiatrists. That's for sure. There was a shortage before all of this mess. And so there's going to be even more demand for those services. So I'm not a mental health professional or a healthcare professional, so I can't speak in detail to that. But I just wonder whether there's something that could be done, potentially even in school, because that's where all the kids go, where there's some sort of potential peer group support, or I don't know the word, maybe some sort of group therapy where they get to talk about things. Because with trauma, it's important to talk about it and process it. And there's different modalities for doing that. Sometimes talking works, sometimes it's other things work better. So I'm hoping that our politicians and education minister are thinking about how do we possibly address some of the mental health stuff within the school system, and maybe we prioritize that over learning about certain other subjects, for example.
Especially for the next year or so.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Cathryn, I'm amazed at the work that you've done. You should tell people how they can be in touch with you, because I think you had a very active Facebook page, although some of the different groups have been deplatformed. So I don't want to send people to Facebook if they're not going to be able to find you there. What's the best way for people to connect with you so that when you are doing future Zoom calls, because I know you're very generous with your time to make, to allow me to speak to your parents. And I think you're doing that with some of the other leadership candidates. So if people want to be able to participate in your group, how do they do it?
The best way to connect with us, and the way that isn't going to get shut down by a social media algorithm is go to our website, familiesforchoice.ca, and you can join our mailing list there. We send emails when we have news. We do not inundate unless we have something to say. So that's your number one, familiesforchoice.ca, the website, and sign up. We do have quite an active Facebook group still. But there's, we do run into some issues there, and we end up in Facebook jail from time to time. We're also on Twitter. So just Families for Choice on social media platforms. But please, if you are interested in what we're doing, if you would like support from us, and if you'd like to stay in touch, then our website, familiesforchoice.ca.
Well, and I know that I will be hearing from you, especially if there's any discussion about putting more restrictions on kids. You've been such a wonderful advocate. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Danielle, for having me.
You bet. That's Cathryn Carruthers. So she is a founder along with many other parents. Sounded like it started as a small group of about 8 parents in a room saying, we got to do something for our kids. And as you heard, I wanted you to hear for yourself what some of these advocates are like, because she's very reasonable. They're really just focused on what's going to be best for kids, especially when we return to school in the fall. And hopefully there won't be the kind of restrictions we've seen in the past. I'll keep on doing this. If you have any other suggestions about other topics that you want to see, the reason I'm doing this is I want you to see the kind of people who are influencing my thinking about future public policy, because sometimes it's unclear where decisions are coming from, and it's unclear where information is coming from. I want you to know that I've always sought out to have balanced information so that I could see the full spectrum. And I hope that the interview with Cathryn helped you to see that there certainly is a broader perspective that we need to have, especially as we get into the next respiratory virus season. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will see you again next time. And just keep tuned to Twitter and Facebook and my locals page. That's where I announce what the next topic's going to be. We'll see you again.